This is the fourth video explaining Achilles, page number 85, second paragraph. Exhausted by his explanation, he sat down, played a short tune on his flute, breaking off to sing in his curious voice. Rose Beetle Man now was tired with his explanation, with his answers by using gestures and his flute, the shepherd's pipe. So as we have seen that he did not speak anything. Whatever the boy asked, he answered with gestures or with a pantomime. And pantomime means, a tune. So he sat down now, played a short tune on his flute, and again played a short tune, breaking off to sing in his curious voice. Breaking off, and here breaking off means to stop. And he stopped, playing. Breaking off to sing in his curious voice. And he actually stopped playing the flute to sing in his curious voice. So now this is the point where he has, he used his voice. They were not clear words, and the words that came from his mouth, they were not clear, but a series of strange grunting, low sounds from his throat, which the boy was unable to understand because they were not clear. And these were the first words from the mouth of the Rose Beetle Man. Presently he stuffed his flute into his bulging pocket and then swung a small sack off his shoulder. So now, presently, at the moment, he put his flute in his bulging, he stuffed it. This means he put it together with the other stuff in his pocket. So he put the flute in his pocket and then swung a small sack off his shoulder and took off a bag from his shoulder. He undid it. And here undid is the past tense of undo. And undo here means to open something that is tied. So he opened the bag, and to my astonishment and to my surprise, half a dozen tortoises tumbled out into the dusty road. And as he opened the bag, half a dozen tortoises, this means six tortoises tumbled out into the dusty road. Tumble means to fall out from the bag. They fall out suddenly from the bag and and rested on the dusty road. Their shells had been polished with oil, and their shells were polished. And he had decorated their front legs with little red bows. And and here bow means a knot that is usually tied on the gift wrappings. It's a kind of knot, decorating knot. So this is the shape that he has used to decorate their front legs, the front legs of tortoises. Slowly the tortoises unpacked their heads and legs from their gleaming shells and set off down the road without enthusiasm. Slowly the tortoises unpacked, as we know that tortoise has a shell where they hide themselves, and slowly they came off from their gleaming shells, and their shells were shining because they were polished with oil from their shining shells, and set off down the ground and sat down on the ground without enthusiasm, without any passion, as they were forced to do so, as they were not interested to do so. I watched them fascinated. The one that particularly took my fancy was small, with a shell the size of a teacup. The boy watched them, fascinated. So he was attracted by them. The one that particularly took my fancy was small, with a shell the size of a teacup. So the one that took his fancy, here it means that the one he wanted to own or to buy was small. He was a small one, with the shell of the size of a teacup, and his shell was the size of a teacup. It seemed much sprightlier than the others, and it was healthy, or full of life, and it was a bit passionate than others, a bit active than others. Its eyes were bright, its walk was alert. Its eyes were bright, his eyes were shining, its eye was shining, and its walk was alert, and he walked a bit alertly. I sat looking at it for a long time, and I looked and stared at it for a long time. I convinced myself that the family would greet its arrival at the villa with enthusiasm. I motivated myself. I told myself that my family will be happy if if I brought to this my house, to the villa. The fact that I had no money on me did not worry me. The boy actually did not have any money to buy the tortoise, but this thing did not worry him. I would simply tell the man to call at the villa for payment. So he did not worry, because he thought that I would simply tell him to come to the villa for the money. It never occurred to me that he might not trust me. I never thought that he may not trust me. The fact that I was English was sufficient. So this boy was English, and it was sufficient because the islanders had a love and respect for the Englishmen. Englishmen were respected by these islanders, so he would trust me. I asked the rose beetle man the price of the little tortoise. So the boy asked him the price for this tortoise. He held up both hands, fingers spread out. So he held up both his hands, fingers spread out. That means 10 units of the currency, whatever would be the currency at that time. I shook my head firmly and held up two fingers, unconsciously imitating him. I shook my head. I nodded my head. I shook my head. I said no. And this wasn't this was an unconscious movement from the boy. He imitated him, he copied him, and he raised two fingers, and that would mean, and boy was not aware what would it mean. It meant 2 units of the currency. He closed his eyes in horror at the thought, and held up 9 fingers. So he closed his eyes. So the rose beetle man closed his eyes at horror, and he was there. It was a bit hilarious that the boy is saying the 2 currency units, and he indicated, now the rose beetle man indicated 9 units of the currency, 9 fingers. I held up 3, and now the boy held up 3 fingers. Means it's a kind of bargaining. The rose beetle man looked sorrowful and sighed, and he looked sorrowful, bit sad and sighed, and he, a little bit low in his mood. So we sat in silence and stared at the tortoise crawling uncertainly about the road. And they both went silent and stared at the tortoise and started looking and looked, for a while at the tortoise crawling, and the tortoise were crawling uncertainly. They did not know where to go, and they were just randomly crawling on the road. Then the rose beetle man picked up Reptile and showed me in pantomime how lovely its shell was. He handed me the tortoise and held up 5 fingers. And finally, the rose beetle man picked the tortoise that was liked by the boy in his hand, and showed to the boy, and presented it to the boy for 5, and held up 5 fingers. That would mean 5 units of the currency.